The lightweight division of the UFC was pretty competitive already, but it's clear who fans should be keeping their eyes on. Islam Makhachev exploded onto the scene and has been demolishing his opponents left and right. His record stands at a very impressive 22 wins, 1 loss, and 0 draws. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at some of Makhachev's opponents and doing a little before and after. So sit back and relax while we get straight into it. We'll start with Makhachev's first UFC opponent, Leo Kuntz. Makhachev made his octagon debut in 2015, taking on the Lion, Leo Kuntz, who was also debuting in the UFC. This was bad news for Makhachev to start with, because Kuntz was a pretty dominant force himself. Kuntz's first bout was way back in 2008. From then to his 2015 bout with Makhachev, the Lion had only ever lost 1 fight, while another ended in a draw. But it's not like Islam was a total underdog either, as he'd been absolutely dominant in his MMA career before this UFC fight. So how did this debut fight go? Well, it went pretty bad, for the Lion, that is. Islam was a force of nature in the ring, giving Leo very little margin to fight back. He did manage to hold on for 2 rounds of the 3-round fight, but he failed to put a dent in Islam. His defeat by submission was really a question of when rather than if. While Leo hadn't had many fights since the one with Islam, his record has been taking a beating since then. In 4 fights, he won 2 and lost 2. The next opponent we'll look at is Adriano Martins. While the fight against Kuntz was Islam's first UFC fight, he'd been competing at other MMA competitions before then. His record so far had been spotless, and it would remain that way until his second UFC fight. Adriano Martins is a veteran of the ring. His first fight was at the Gladiator of the Jungle event in 2004. The encounter with Islam Makhachev was in 2015, so the guy was rocking 11 years of fight experience by then. Even in the UFC, Martins had been fighting since 2013. As dominant as Islam had been, this would be a challenge, and it was, at the time, more than Islam could handle. He was laid out by an overhand right from Adriano Martins, who was able to bring the match to a swift finish before the end of the first round. Spoiler alert for the rest of the video, this is Islam Makhachev's only loss to this day, which is something that Adriano Martins can be proud of. The fight gave Islam a lot to think about, but it also should have given Martins a lot to think about. It turns out that this fight was the last one that Adriano ever won. He's competed 6 times since then, and though the bout with Adriano Oliveira ended in a no contest, the rest were all losses. Could it be that defeating Islam took every ounce of fight that Adriano had left? Seems more likely that Martins has been in the game a long time and is starting to sport some ring rust. From here, let's move on to Ragin' Cajun Johnson. Post-defeat, Makhachev told interviewers that he was going to take something from his loss and work on himself as a fighter. As such, he wasn't back for another round until almost a year later, when he got in the ring with Chris Wade. His first 3 bouts back in the UFC ended in victories for him, but his real comeback was around the corner. If Adriano Martins was an experienced fighter, Cajun Johnson is on his way to becoming an MMA legend. His first bout was a victory against Eric Harvey at Roadhouse Rumble 5. That's right, 2002. His record of 23-13-1 is impressive enough, but the important thing for Islam is that Johnson had fought Martins before, and he'd won. For that reason, Islam's defeat of Ragin' Cajun Johnson would redeem him for the loss that took the wind out of his sails all those years ago, and that's exactly what he did when he stepped into the octagon with Johnson in 2018. While Cajun proved to be a tough customer for Islam, he wasn't too tough in the end, as Islam had Johnson tapping out before the first round concluded. Little did we know at the time that giving Islam a chance at redemption was one of the last things Cajun Johnson would do. After one more loss to Rustam Khabilov, Johnson retired from MMA. We don't blame him. He'd been in the game for a long time and had nothing left to prove. Meanwhile, Islam's tear through the MMA world continued. His next big fight came against Davi Ramos. By this point, Islam was beginning to develop a chip on his shoulder. He frequently complained that the UFC wasn't giving him an opponent of his caliber, and that he deserved to duke it out with a real fighter. Well, the UFC was listening, and shortly after his win over Cajun, he got his wish. Davi Ramos hadn't been fighting as long as some of Islam's past opponents, but he definitely made an impression on the MMA scene. In fact, before his fight with Islam, Davi had only lost one of his UFC bouts, that being the first one. The MMA community was in agreement that Davi Ramos might just be the challenge that Islam was looking for. He proved himself to be a competitor at Islam's level for sure, as the two of them duked it out across all 3 rounds of their fight. Neither one was going to tap out or get knocked out, but when the dust settled and the judges rendered their verdict, the outcome was clear. It was a win for Islam with a unanimous decision. But that's no knock on Ramos, who gave Islam his toughest fight yet. Ramos has had 2 fights since the encounter with Islam, both of them ending in defeats by unanimous decision. We're starting to notice some kind of pattern with Islam's opponents here. Why do they end up having a string of losses after a fight with him? Islam was really ascending the ladder of the lightweight division. His name started appearing in more sentences alongside the name Khabib. Let's move on to the time when Drew Dober decided to take a crack at Islam. Even as Islam Makhachev was clamoring for a shot at the championship, he had turned into a giant in the lightweight division that everyone wanted to slay. As his profile grew in the wake of his victory over Ramos, it was Drew Dober who started talking smack and asking for a fight with Islam. Dober has had a pretty respectable career in MMA so far, competing in a variety of MMA promotions since 2009. His record stands at 25-11 with a single no contest, an eyebrow-raising record for sure. The confidence with which he was challenging Islam Makhachev was more than just hot air, and Makhachev was more than happy to give Dober the fight that he wanted. At this point, it doesn't really feel like much of a surprise anymore when we tell you that Islam has won yet another one of his fights. While Dober didn't go down easily, lasting into the 3rd round of the fight, he was eventually submitted by Islam with an arm triangle. If we didn't have Dober's stats, we might have called his confidence from before overconfidence. For someone who's been fighting as long as Drew Dober has, 1 loss didn't get him too much. After all, defeat is as much a part of sports as victory is. Since his fight with Islam, he's gone to have 3 more bouts, having won 2 of them, but having also lost to Brad Riddell. Finally, we take a look at Islam's next opponent, Charles Oliveira. Tune in to UFC 280 on the 22nd of October to catch Islam Makhachev's next fight. Could this be the one where he finally loses? Well, the stats seem to be in his favor, but fans should only discount Charles Oliveira at their own peril. Oliveira might be one of the most accomplished opponents Islam has ever faced. Check this out. Over a career spanning more than a decade, his record stands at 33 wins and just 8 losses, with 1 no contest. He's also one of the best in the UFC at submissions, which is something that Islam has gotten a lot of mileage out of so far in his career. For Islam, defeating Oliveira may just be the final push he needs to finally get consideration for the lightweight championship. Sure, Oliveira isn't the champ right now, but he's still one of the titans of the division and a great guy to add to your body count on your rise to the top. Now, we don't have an after for this fight because it hasn't happened yet, but for the first time since 2018, there seems to be some kind of a chance that Islam Makhachev will add another loss to his record. Mark the date in your calendar, folks, October 22nd. It's not a long time from now. That's it for today's video. How do you guys think Islam's fight with Charles Oliveira is going to go? Can you see him with the lightweight belt around his waist? Or do you think this train will be stopped at some point? Let us know in the comments section below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.